perhaps introduce ourselves first of all.
Yeah.
This is obviously for NoiseFloor. This is like the 13th of April. So we're all supposedly just coming out of lockdown, but obviously Mark has kindly asked us to talk to each other, to introduce our work, and I suppose find out a little bit more about each other as if we were at NoiseFloor. So yeah, we'll give it a go. I mean, Amy, it's a pleasure to meet you, to be honest, over the last few weeks since Mark, kind of put us together for this. It's been a real pleasure, I have to say, to kind of listen to some of your works and kind of get to know your music before even meeting you.
Thank you. Yeah, same with you. It's been just a wonderful dive into so many different areas of your work. You do so much in so many different threads. So it was lovely to take a swim in that.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I have to say, when you talk about lots of different ideas and different threads, I have to say, looking at and listening to some of your work, I have to say, I think my threads are quite narrow. Yours seem to be hugely broad. I mean, when I was looking, I mean, it's like, I suppose the first thing I was going to ask is, it's like some of your instrumental works, they seem to be kind of really like composed, almost like avant-garde classical works. I mean, if avant-garde has a use these days, but then like some of your guitar pieces and your like Scavenger album have a really beautiful, almost jazz-like kind of intimacy. I mean, how do you reconcile these worlds, or do these worlds not even mean anything to you these days?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I think that I had a weird trajectory to end up where I was. I did my undergrad in jazz guitar, and then after I graduated, I tried to learn classical, but I would never call myself a classical guitarist. And then I ended up doing an MA in composition, and now I'm doing a degree which is half science, half art. So I had this zigzag, and I think, yeah, they definitely had an influence on different parts of my music.
But do you think of them as different parts? I mean, obviously, you talk about your research, your PhD, which, as you say, is half science. We can talk about that in a bit. But I mean, do you see those as different types of musical activity you're engaged in, or are they all just one thing?
They're pretty much all one thing.
And is this something you've always, I mean, have you always been interested in just sound and music, or is this something you came to through playing?
I think, yeah, I have. I think because I also had a bit of a scattered background in terms of my musical education. Like when I went to university, I actually didn't know how to read music. I faked my way through the audition. So I had deep holes in my musical education. And so I think some of my priorities ended up being things that possibly, you wouldn't find on the usual trajectory of someone on a musical education track. So I think, yeah, definitely the sound was always a priority, more so than other things.
So did you grow up playing instruments, or what was your musical background, if you talk about these holes?
I played a little bit of flute for a very brief period of time, and then I taught myself guitar from when I was a teenager. And then I went right into university after spending about 2 years working as an intern at a recording studio, which was great fun.
That sounds like a lot of fun. What kind of things did you do at the studio?
Well, for the first year, just get coffee, but I learned a lot.
I'm sure that's the best coffee ever.
But yeah, that was my track, and I sort of ended up, and you're in the same way. You do so much work in academia, with all your your histories and writings on Roberto Gerhardt, and then you're also writing about collaborative processes and creativity, and you're writing this beautiful music and as well. I actually wanted to ask you the exact same question, which is, do you see a thread in between all the different branches of what you do?
Yeah, I suppose I do, to be honest. I mean, I suppose from when I was young, I was perhaps unlike you. I was set from a very early age that I wanted to do music. I kind of sang and played and started composing quite young. Although then, you know, the idea of like doing electronic music or anything like that was nowhere near kind of possible for me. You know, I'm of the age where, you know, I was brought up with things like the ZX81 and the Sinclair, you know, so memory and the idea of being able to do anything with sound was just way beyond those things. So most of my early pieces and works were for instruments, or mainly choral, you know, choirs that I sang in and for people I knew. But I was always interested in I suppose this kind of stranger side of things. This kind of, I remember when I was 13 or 14 at my local library, there was this wonderful lady who had come down from the Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester to look after her mother. And she introduced me to the idea of interlibrary loans. And she was saying, you can get all of these crazy scores. So she got me like Penderecki First Symphony, which of course I thought was amazing because it was just like the biggest score I had ever seen. And I had no idea what it sounded like, but it just looked absolutely crazy. So from then on, I was trying to find as many different kind of like new pieces, mainly instrumental at that point, but I just devoured everything I could possibly find. So from that, I suppose that stimulated my interest in unusual sound or experimental approaches to sound. And from then on, electronics just seemed like the natural extension to that. So I suppose the work on Roberto Gerard, I suppose I see that as, again, just part of the kind of the history of where we are now, you know, that kind of divergent practice after the Second World War. Because I do think electronic music has become quite different from contemporary instrumental music. You know, I know there's lots and lots of different approaches, but from my point of view, I do see it as quite a different kind of practice and a different way of working and working with people. So from that point of view, I see that lineage of like the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, Daphne Oram, Roberto Gerard as kind of charting that new territory. And I suppose from my point of view, I'm just interested. I'm interested in these people, you know, often working, you know, alone and doing some quite strange things at that time. You know, I mean, I remember seeing the first pictures of, you know, Gerard's dining room turned into a studio. And of course, you know, we don't think anything of having a laptop and that kind of stuff in our house now, but, you know, thinking that he had 3 or 4 tape machines and, you know, tapes all nailed to the wall and things like that. It's just astonishing. So yeah, from that point of view, I do see them as interlinked. But yeah, perhaps it's easier to see that, or for me to think about that, than it is to see it from the outside.
Well, it's funny that you brought up the whole, like, you know, electronic composer working in isolation, because you do so much work, collaborative work. And that, I mean, perhaps I'm wrong on this, but that's almost an unusual way of working for someone working in the electronic music.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I suppose in like contemporary pop music and that kind of thing, we're used to kind of people working together. But I suppose more art side of things and electroacoustic music, it is more unusual. I have to say, I found it really, really stimulating. You know, having worked with people like Terry Huron, based in Canada,
Yes.
who you may know, and Paulina Sundin, a fantastic Swedish composer as well. I've found working with somebody over a long period of time, where, you know, there are periods obviously where one of us has traveled and we've worked in a studio together, sat right next to each other as we are making sounds. You know, which for many composers is not what they do. You know, many composers will say the act of creation, it's like, I don't want people listening to what I'm making because 90% of it will sound awful, first of all. But I've actually found it really, really stimulating, and how they approach sound, how they think about it, how they talk about it, And especially somebody like Terry, who is both a performer and a composer and has a very hands-on approach. When I mean hands-on, the way in which she works with Ableton, the way she works with sound is very kind of tactile. There's lots of live processing, lots of like controllers, whereas mine is much more kind of, surgical. I tend to do everything digitally and knit things together very painstakingly in the studio. So from that point of view, it's extremely, extremely refreshing. And I think some of those, again, they've pushed me to do things that I don't think I would have ever done before. So from that point of view, it's an extremely enriching experience, and something that, yes, I love working on my own and, creating my own projects. But, seeded throughout all of that are these collaborative things that I would not have missed for anything. So
they take you in new directions that you would not probably have been going in on your own, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, I think Terry with, for example, I did a project from Prom Digital with Terry called Lepidoptera, and this was a series of pieces for recorders and electronics. And one of the things we looked at in that was a lot of algorithmic structures, which Terry was very much into, and I had not used very much at all. And she came up with this way of working with Ableton that I just found totally amazing. And I haven't seen anybody use it in a similar way to the way that Terry was and has used it since. And that opened up a completely different way of thinking about structuring the music, especially in live performance, because a lot of the work that Terry was doing at that point was kind of improvised. There was a general kind of shape that we had, but much of the kind of moment-to-moment structure was improvised for her. And that again was quite remarkable, and ended up with pieces that I thought sounded really quite fresh and dynamic and did something rather different.
Yeah, they are beautiful pieces. I think I didn't get a chance to. I've heard other pieces of Terry's live, but not this one. So,
but if you, how does that kind of the idea of studio practice and performance work in your music? Because obviously, as a performer yourself, I can imagine, having listened to the kind of hour-long dance piece you did, really beautiful, stunning acousmatic piece.
Thank you.
I mean, that sounds, very beautifully crafted, and yet at the same time, listening to, some of the graphic scores and some of the guitar pieces where you've got people on stage picking and kind of being really quite visceral with the instrument. I mean, how do you approach that balance between kind of, rigidity of kind of studio-based practice where you can knit things together and that grittiness of performance?
Well, in this case, they actually ended up being sort of similar, because I didn't have a good studio when I did that hour-long acousmatic piece. I was actually working on a 15-year-old G4 using, I think, Pro Tools 6.
Right.
So the grittiness was already, baked into it by, basically me using the tools that I had available. But that piece was all built out of recordings of 16th century dance pieces that had been transcribed for guitar. And it ended up being very smooth and fluid and not at all guitar-like, and not at all gritty, like you said, or visceral. But how do I get that balance? I don't know. Each unique situation needs its own sound, and I think I just go where the instinct takes me. And in that piece, it went one direction, and then the other ones, it went a completely different way.
But I mean, again, I know each piece may be different, but how do you start with the piece? Do you think of like the title, the ideas? Does it come out of, talking with collaborators?
No, I usually am imagining the sound first. Usually it'll end up appearing, I'm not like, I don't have synesthesia or anything like that, but I usually tend to conceptualize sounds as being physical shapes. So I'll imagine the shape of the piece from beginning to end, in a very sort of physical, visual way. And then I try to make the sound mimic what I can see / hear in my mind, and usually that will just follow its own logic after that.
So when you talk about that, does that mean you have a? I mean, it may not be a sense of what the piece is doing moment to moment, but does that mean you start a piece already knowing the kind of shape or trajectory or that it's going to be?
Yeah, I don't, obviously, I mean, it's not 100%, but it usually ends up being a representation of what I originally imagined in terms of like the form and the shape and the textures that I want. And usually color doesn't come into it. So that's why I say it's not really a synesthetic thing at all. But yeah, usually it does end up sort of sounding like I had seen it. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. I have to say, in a way, I'm kind of similar in so much that I can't really start a piece until I have an idea of what its character is. It's kind of overall, not necessarily. Well, no, I do actually have an idea of its shape, but very definitely its sound character. What it's going to do. Because I know some classical composers will, talk about the idea that, the piece is already written. All I have to do is write it down.
Yeah.
I mean, I think as electronic musicians, it's slightly more difficult in so much that, sometimes the idea can, I don't know about you, but the idea can be fully fleshed out in a couple of hours, but it might take another month to put it together.
Writing it down is, for us, is like, that's when the long work starts, bringing it into the world. Yeah.
But is that the same? I mean, is that the same when you write an instrumental piece? I mean, so you have the same kind of, and is it the sound world in itself, or do the instrumental pieces start with more of a kind of pitch idea, or is that again something that comes afterwards?
No, it's much more of a visual thing. Although I do connect certain like textures or shapes with particular kinds of sounds, but it's like a translation process. I see the piece and then I try to translate it into something that can actually be created through sound. So yeah, it's
and do you draw these things? I mean, because I know a lot of composers they will. I mean, obviously, we're used these days to seeing kind of graphic scores for electroacoustic pieces, and I know most composers, it's kind of scribble things down. I mean, I know you've done a mixture of notated scores and graphic scores as well. I mean, are those kind of, when you are sketching like an electronic piece, do they look like your graphic scores, or are they literally just, incomprehensible scribbles on paper, first of all?
I would say I usually only draw if I'm having a really hard time hearing it / seeing it in my mind. It's sort of a process to get to the final solution. So it doesn't actually end up looking anything like I imagine it or how it ends up sounding. It's like just a writer's block technique I have. But the graphic scores, they actually don't end up looking anything like what I'm imagining. They're much more of a practical guide, I guess. I really do think of them as a notation more than a sonic representation, I think. But I was curious about your process as well, what you'd said about how you sort of conceptualize the whole piece beginning to end before you start. So this is something that is similar to your own process.
Yeah, I think, I think it's something I've honestly come to learn about the way I go about things over many years. When I was a student, I started literally by recording lots of interesting sounds in the studio. Now, I was really fortunate. I had a group of composers that included people like Adrian Moore, Natasha Barrett, Pete Stollery, Andrew Lewis, some really eminent electroacoustic composers. And we used to have these kind of group recording sessions. Alistair MacDonald was in there as well. He was one of the prime movers for many of these things. Kind of late night sessions, we'd book a studio and we'd all go in and we'd help each other record, often hours and hours of sound. I suppose I started, I became interested in almost like collecting lots of little sounds, and processing them and making interesting things. But I found that after a while, you know, I was putting things together that sounded interesting, but I'm not quite sure that the overall was that interesting. And it was only when I then started, you know, thinking less about the individual sounds themselves, and, you know, coming with almost like the overall architecture of what a piece was like. And I suppose it is to a certain extent. It's like having that skeletal frame. And if you know what the skeletal frame is doing, then you can kind of mold and sculpt sounds around that. And you end up with a whole that, you know, is 80% of what you intended it to be, and then 20% hopefully kind of magic on top. That's when I think I realized, you know, how important a kind of underlying structure was within all of the pieces that I was doing, no matter how kind of fluid or what their surface sound was like. And of course, you know, you could say that's exactly what you do for composition, but in a way, it's a very different approach. I remember John T. Harrison, when he was talking about a piece of his called Pair Ampere, putting together these very, very small fragments of sound to make these larger gestures. And I suppose over time, I tended to see things the other way, you know, that you had this very kind of global structure and you slowly worked your way into it rather than out. I don't know if that's the same for you, but I mean, that's definitely how I approach things now.
Well, I think I feel like I'm a little bit in the middle of that, because I've worked, or I've tried to work a lot with timbre and extended techniques, and what I've tried to do lately is actually leave that to the very end of the compositional process and try to get the bones of the piece and all the other things done before I jump into the timbral sound, because often, you know, I may end up with something that's just a sequence of wonderful sounds, and however much I love those sounds, if there's no structure or skeleton or something connecting them together, they're meaningless. So I'm trying to like leave the fun to the end, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I read that you had sort of maybe this is the wrong word, but like a creative epiphany where you changed your style, and I think this may be around the period where you had mentioned where you were sort of focusing on collecting sounds, and then you went into a different method of working, and I think it's described somewhere as like oceanic glitch.
Yeah.
And is that what you mean when you say when you're looking at the superstructure and then making your way slowly into it?
Yeah, I think it was, because having grown up in, you know, places, working in studios like Beast in Birmingham and at UEA in Norwich, I think I see those very much as almost like an apprenticeship. You know, they were fantastic experience. I'd kind of, as it were, learned my trade, learned the tools of the trade, learned techniques and things. But I think at that point, I was very much working within a kind of accepted style. And although I still like many of those pieces, I think it's only in about 2005, 6, when I literally took a year or so's break, that I really, took a step back and started composing pieces that I think are really me. And it's very strange because the actual technique was exactly the same. You know, I still love, you know, like you with the guitar, I still love recording my own sounds. I still love processing them and discovering all the wonderful and weird things you can do with them in the studio. It's just literally the kind of the way in which the surface sounded that was different, and the way I was actually conceptualizing the pieces from the start. The actual process of making has pretty much stayed the same. So from that point of view, yes, it was very much a kind of conceptual break, but the process of actually working in the studio is something that ever since I walked into the studios at Birmingham and John T. Harrison introduced me to the studio, it felt as though I was home. It felt like a very natural place to be for me. I'd always found, writing notes on a page rather difficult, to be honest, and still do. I always found that tactility of working with sound, very, very, just a very natural way of actually making music.
Oh yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like even with my classical pieces or the acoustic pieces, I actually end up working in Pro Tools often. Much
Really?
more. I take rehearsal recordings, or if there's a particular technique, I can take a sample from YouTube or something, and I'll construct it all. You're right. There's just something so effortless about working with the actual sound versus trying to get your brain to read the score and fire the neurons and have it that way.
I mean, perhaps now is the time. Do you mind if we turned and talked a bit about one piece in particular?
Yeah, sure.
Because obviously, having listened to a number of your pieces, the string quartet threads. I mean, having listened to Scavenger, the very, really very beautiful, delicate guitar piece that I recommend everybody listen to immediately. Threads really does stand out and somewhat apart from that. When I talk about the kind of viscerality, there's points at which, I hear almost like a kind of, like Kaya Sariaho and pieces like Nymphaea, these really quite brutal kind of, string gestures counterpointed with these very Sariaho, like kind of almost beautiful tonal sections that come out of it. It's a really striking piece.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And we'll play a little bit in a minute. But can you tell me how you went about putting that piece together in particular?
Sure. Yeah. String players usually send me the bill for their bow rehairing after each performance. Yeah, it does. There's a significant amount of very fast tremolo in that piece. Yeah, that whole piece is blocks. One of the things that I do quite a lot more recently that just sort of happened naturally, but I didn't realize it until recently, is I really love the contrast between very tonal traditional playing and then also the opposite extreme. So I really like the contrast between those two worlds. And I think in this piece, you really get a back and forth in that way.
And do you see those elements as kind of different polarities, or are they, do you juxtapose them as kind of like noise and pitch, or are they
just different timbres? They're to me, they're equivalent. They're just different kinds of sound. I don't know how to better describe it than that.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
And is these when you're composing a piece like that, is that something that you composed in Pro Tools as well and put together lots of different kind of sections, or
the some parts, the timbral parts, yes. The more traditional ones, no, that was just straight up Sibelius.
But do you end up putting those into Pro
I do
Tools
sometimes.
as well?
I do sometimes. Yeah. I'll export the MIDI and then I'll, I'm doing that with a piece now. I in Pro Tools I have half actual real instruments playing and half MIDI. It's just I don't know. I always revert back to Pro Tools and working that way.
Yeah, no, I mean I have to say I find fascinating because when I've done some collaborative pieces, I end up with what I call these Frankenstein mixes, which are literally, it's like I have to preface it by saying the piece will not sound like this, but this is how it's going to go. And it's literally all these like gross MIDI things, and then some really nice, beautiful gestures and things coming out. Some beautifully crafted electroacoustic things, and then this like really garish kind of like trombone or something, I don't know, that is actually meant to be a recorder, but I haven't got a recorder.
I know. So, we're in the future, there's no flying cars. MIDI still sounds like it did 30 years ago. What's going on?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. But I have to say, using Pro Tools for things like that, it does completely change the way that you actually put things together. I mean, do you find that working with like Pro Tools and technology like that has enabled you to think about kind of form or the way in which you change material, process material differently, that you don't necessarily think of it as a bunch of notes, that you think of it as a stream of audio?
Yeah, I don't know. My instinct is it just feels like it cuts out the middleman of notation. Like if you're thinking of notation as just instructions, if you're the working in Pro Tools is so much closer to working with the real performance, if that makes sense. And then you can take that sound and engrave the instructions so that you get the closest representation of it. But in terms of composing, like my feeling is that I get a much closer relationship with the eventual performance if I'm working with sound versus writing. Yeah.
And with a piece like Threads, how much opportunity did you have to work with the performers or record the performers before you actually presented them with a finished score?
I think I had one rehearsal before I presented them with the finished score. So it went, I wrote it and then it went and I got the rehearsal back. No, sorry, I got the performance back. And then I rewrote about 25% of it. And then that ended up being pretty much the finished score, except for a few tweaks here and there.
And is that quite usual for you? I mean, like tweaking and getting feedback, from musicians and then producing a final version, or do you tend to just, produce the score and that's it?
Oh no, I'm always tweaking. I think I find it takes me at least a minimum 3 revisions before I end up with something that I'm satisfied with.
And are those revisions mainly due to kind of technique or form, or?
Usually it's what I imagined would happen doesn't end up happening. I was like, if I write this will happen. And then the opposite happens and I'm like, okay, that didn't work. Back to the drawing board. Yeah.
Yep.
about yourself? Like when there must be a big difference for you between, working in the studio in your usual way and then, or composing something acoustic. Or is it the same?
No, I find I do tend to think of them as completely different. Well, not completely different, but my approach is very different. So if I'm working in the studio, very often, as I say, I'll have an idea of what the piece is going to do, what it's going to be. So I'll record all of the sounds or work with musicians to record the sounds. Like some of the pieces I've been working on at the moment, they utilize the wonderful voice of a Swedish composer and singer called Girolao Bars. He has this amazing, I mean, he's kind of, think he's half Russian, half Finnish, and lives in Sweden. So as you could imagine, as a kind of 6'5", singer, his voice is deep and resonant and is just sumptuous to work with. So he recorded a whole bunch of material for me, and I've been working with that. But when I'm working in the studio, I'll work very quickly. I'll process the sounds, and I'll have a whole range of sounds that I know I'm going to work with, but then I can put together a whole piece literally in a matter of days. And I'll work very, very quickly and intensely on it, but then I'll leave it. So at the moment, I'm coming back to pieces that I wrote last July, August, and thinking, okay, there's way too much reverb on that. And, that then becomes, I suppose, that more elaborate, painstaking approach to actually mixing it and making it properly. So much more of an emphasis on, kind of reverb filtering, shaping those dynamics, sidechain compression, getting the center image right, much more of the kind of mechanics of it.
Yeah, there was a piece that you had just released that seemed to be a revised Winter Tendrils.
Yes.
You had written it, and then, so what was that whole process of going back and revising that and re-releasing it?
Well, that was a piece that I'd originally written for Seth Parker Woods, an American cellist, in 2014, and he premiered it in 2015. And for me, at that point, I wanted to create quite a different work for him. Seth is a really dynamic cellist, and a lot of the works he plays are really very dynamic, very gritty. Again, very physical. He has a wonderful presence on the stage, and I wanted to write something for him that reflected a different side of his personality. Because when we talked, especially because he was visiting Huddersfield as he was doing his PhD, we'd talk about running and yoga and completely different things than just music all the time. And it struck me that there was actually a side of Seth's personality that was very different from the one that you often saw on stage. So having written this piece, I think the thing that for me was problematic about it was the disjunction between the electronics and the cello. And in the revision, I ended up recording him over and over again, creating multiple lines. So in essence, at certain points, you have this completely isolated cello with these very kind of tendril-like fragile electronic parts. And then towards the middle, you get many more different kind of, versions of him. So when it's, we had the opportunity to perform in Seattle on a kind of, 40-channel sound system, which was fantastic. As a result, you had him in the center of the room being surrounded by multiple versions of himself, which was, it was absolutely beautiful. But it's that type of thing that can sometimes take a long time, but I mean, part of that was the fact that he played it a number of times, but he was always traveling around so much, and we never actually got the time to be in the studio together. It was not until we were in Dartmouth in 2018 that we actually had a week where we could actually do it. So sometimes these things take a long time, and often, especially working on the instrumental side of things, it is not just how I feel about the piece. By this point, Seth had played it 10 or 15 times. He'd built up quite a personal relationship with it too. So going in and changing the piece, yes, it's my piece, but I almost felt as though I wanted to ask his permission, to say, it's like, this is actually, your piece. You've invested a huge amount of time in learning this and playing it and taking it on the road. Are we okay if we do this? And he was very good about it. And eventually then we were able to put a film with it as well. And yes, I think it's become the piece I had in my head to start off with.
Oh, it's such a beautiful piece. I loved, and the everything about it, like the film was lovely as well. But what struck me was when you mentioned the multiple recorded lines, because that's what I found so engaging and disconcerting about the piece, is that he would play and then of course things would continue, and there was this sort of very disorienting aspect to it. It was lovely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I've often found in, especially pieces that combine instruments and electronics. There's that ability to extend the instrument and create these almost imaginary instruments,
Yeah.
where the blending is so carefully done. And then there's the opposite, where you have these massive disjuncts and you have almost like a dramatic relationship between them. I mean, I have to say, when I was listening to the beginning of Scavenger, there's like the artificial light track, which I found, I mean, I really loved it because there was this beautiful guitar, and then there was almost like these squealy kind of electronics in the background, and they were both very clearly kind of like doing the same kind of thing, but almost occupying like a different vocabulary. I don't know if that was how it was meant to be, but
well, yeah, well, it sort of was like I had never done any electroacoustic composition at all before I did that album. I had written all these acoustic guitar pieces, but they weren't enough. There was something that was missing. And I'd performed a lot of them live and was very disappointed by my performances. So I had all these recordings and I just wanted to destroy them. So I did. I destroyed them with processing. So all the electronics is the same piece, but processed. And I found there's two things that I learned from that. One, that I really loved pairing electronics made out of acoustic recordings with acoustic sound. For me, that had the right kind of blend that worked for what I was trying to get to. And the second thing was I can't remember what my second thing was. But yeah, that was my whole process for sort of coming into the electroacoustic world. And I wanted to think of them both as completely separate, but also very deeply linked together, which they are, because it's the same piece played in the exact same time span.
I mean, if you don't mind me asking, what type of things did you do to create such? I mean, they are. If anybody hasn't heard it, again, Artificial Light is one of the first tracks on the album, and there is this. It is. I mean, it sounds performed, but it sounds completely abstract as well. I mean, what did you do to the guitar sounds to get them to sound like that?
There's hidden benefits to buying the world's cheapest computer to run Pro Tools 6 on. So I used this legacy pitch shifter, which was back in 2004. I'm assuming pitch shifting technology wasn't the greatest, so I maxed it out, and it made all sorts of wonderful sounds.
Yeah.
And I just basically made like 30 or 35 layers of these different ones.
So it's almost playing with like the artifacts of the plugin.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is.
It sounds fantastic. I mean, it's the type of thing that I can imagine composers these days would spend like hundreds of dollars on Euro racks to get this kind of, meaty, squelchy sound.
All you have to do is go to your nearest garage sale and get the world's oldest computer.
That's, I mean, when you talk about, working with instruments, one of the things that struck me, especially in like the augmented reality piece you have, Boundary, is these really exquisitely beautifully recorded kind of flute and extended flute sounds. I mean, what was the inspiration for that piece to use those particular sounds in that way?
I often will recycle things. This was another situation where I had made this beautiful piece, or I had made this piece for this beautiful performer, Sarah Constant, Microchimerisms. And she recorded it, very beautifully at a great studio in Toronto. No $200 computer for her. This was actually, recorded really nicely in a nice way. I ended up, with this piece, this has been the first version of it. So it wasn't finished yet. So I had all this material, but I felt like I didn't have a piece that was complete yet. And so I had created this work, Boundary, and I needed material for the sonic soundscape. And so I used this because it was basically a ready-made sound bank. And, I had wanted Boundary to be reactive to hand gestures, but I hadn't quite conceived of exactly how that was supposed to sound. So it was sort of a happy accident that I had this giant sound bank of flute techniques. And when strangely enough, what didn't work in a piece over, a set period of time, like a concert piece, worked great in an augmented reality situation where everything's happening simultaneously. So it's really strange to not repurpose this material, but to find the right medium for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sometimes things won't work as a concert piece, but they will work in another scenario. And this was, I think, an example of that. Just finding the right spot for it.
It's like everything. I think I don't know about you, but I have a repository of sounds that I keep on hard disks and some of the older stuff still on DVDs and things like that. That I know will come in useful at some point. For some of these pieces with Girolal, I was using sounds that I'd actually recorded in 2007. Which again I used for a dance piece, which was perfectly fine, but I was never quite happy with it as a piece. And then repurposing as sounds that accompanied his voice, it was like, it works.
I don't know. I think composers are all great recyclers.
Yeah.
You never throw anything away, even the stuff that doesn't work, because you may need it again at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is as well how they can sometimes, when you listen to things, how they can stimulate ideas that you may not use them in a piece, but just listening back, they can be equally inspiring in their own particular way.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to ask, how come you with Boundary as well? How did you get involved in the kind of augmented reality side of things? Because again, it's another kind of aspect to your work. Because I know you've used it in guitar pieces as well with electronics, not just the installation.
Yeah, I came across it in 2016 with an artist named Shen Novak from New Zealand. He's a visual artist, and he had done these AR installations, and it just sort of blew the top of my head off, because I loved the idea of mixing the digital worlds and the real worlds together. Of course, I had tried VR, and it's an incredible experience to be inside a VR headset. But I had always loved the idea of mixing the real and the digital together, and what the thin line between that would be. And so when AR technologies came along, where you could actually, use your hands as controllers, for me, that was just another step in the direction of, absolute zero boundary between digital and the real worlds in our physical lives. Of course, we're, on digital communications all the time. We are right now, but there's always an interface. And I was just really fascinated with non-interface digital techniques. So just actually being able to touch and not necessarily feel, but to be able to interact with the digital world with our physical bodies. So that's kind of what I got interested in with that.
I mean, would you mind talking about because one of the things, I mean, I thought Boundary, the way in which the visual itself worked with the flute sounds. I thought that was really striking, actually, because you had these beautiful sounds that were obviously from a flute, and the way they interacted with the kind of visual side, and how the video works. It wasn't just like here is this strange object and this map to this strange sound. There was a real poeticism between the two. And I think because there wasn't that kind of, very direct one-to-one thing happening all the time, it enabled that space for the audience to actually interpret something. I mean, the one thing I noticed about because we've talked about timbre a little bit and how you think about that. I mean, it struck me looking through the works that you've composed that, it's easy to say you're a guitarist, but the number of different types of guitar you've used, electric, acoustic, and the Brahms guitar.
Oh, yeah.
Again, each one seems to be chosen for its particular timbre or a particular way in which you conceive the piece.
I think guitarists tend to be pretty, I'm going to say non-monogamous when it comes to their instruments. I think most guitarists will say that they even if they're classical, they'll be playing electric as well. And in terms of like the more obscure ones like 10-string or the Brahms guitar, most often I would meet a performer who played those, and then we would have a collaboration. So that's how I ended up writing for those, by just meeting these brilliant performers and and being able to write for them. But that's how those pieces ended up coming into being.
Is it a different kind of collaboration when you yourself are a guitarist?
Yeah, it is a bit strange. We can talk the same language, so that makes things a little bit easier. I find that when I'm working with other instrumentalists, I'll have to do a lot more research on how exactly the techniques are going to occur. With guitar, it's a little bit more straightforward. But there's also back and forth as well about the proper way to do things, or is this possible? Is this not possible? How dare you ask me to do that to my instrument? That kind of thing. So, yeah. And how about yourself? I mean, I know that you had mentioned that you sang in the shower or in the bathtub as a child, but you're instrumentalist as well, right?
Yes, I mean, I grew up as a clarinetist, a pianist, and eventually playing organ as well. Yeah. So yeah, from my point of view, I think there's something, even in a lot of my electronic work, still something very central about that idea of instrumentality. Literally during lockdown is the first time I have composed with, I would say, found sound. Kind of like environmental materials in probably almost a decade, to be honest. For the last kind of 8 or 10 years, all of my pieces have either been working with instrumentalists like Terry or Seth, with other composers who we've worked then with instrumentalists like with Paulina and the Stockholm Saxophone Quartet, or the percussionist Johnny Axelson, and again then taking some of those recordings that we've made and working on my own projects with those, or in some cases just actually getting into the studio and recording all of the instruments myself. I kind of, at the university where I work in Huddersfield, we have this great percussion store, and there are a number of occasions where I've kind of booked a recording session at 8 o'clock in the evening and then wheeled things from the store up in the lift up to the studio and recorded kind of brake discs and xylophones and marimbas and all kinds of things, and then with those recordings then made pieces. But this year, I suppose, because I haven't been able to get into the university, it's been quite different. The project that I've done most recently has no instruments in it at all, and it goes back very much to where I started. This is it's a collaboration again with a photographer, Yan Wang Preston, and this is literally, she's been recording the same location, both in film and photographs, every day for the past year. Essentially, she started just before lockdown, and I've gone up every month and recorded the sound around the site. And this is quite a desolate site, so it's mainly kind of birds, wind, but what we've tried to do is really to concentrate on, again, the really quite intimate sounds that you can get through picking things up with a microphone. So the kind of the branches of trees rubbing together, leaves, when over winter, when all the water, because it's quite high up in Todmorden, when it froze, there was these huge slabs of ice on these kind of quite large streams, and kind of breaking those, recording with hydrophone, but also just recording the ice itself. Oh, wow. There was points at which Jan was breaking the ice, rubbing the ice together, throwing these small bits of ice around, and there's this kind of real depth to those sounds that even now I listen, and it's just amazing sounds in themselves. So yeah, from that point of view, I think that that has been quite different, in so much that all of that previous instrumentality and the concern about not just pitch but timbre and the way I've used things to create quite abstract pieces. Again, it's quite refreshing in a way, because I've gone back to where I started almost 25 years ago now, and just concentrating on the real quality of recording, and how I remember, Dennis Smalley once saying to me after a concert that 80% of a good piece is starting off with the right recordings. And if you've got really beautiful recordings, it opens up so many different avenues to you. And of course, he's right. Being able to go up and record these sounds. I mean, just recording the bird sounds up there. I went up just last month. It was one of the last times we were up there, and it was almost as though we got up there, and it's almost like this one bird was sitting in the tree, going, "Right, I want to give you a 25 performance." I just let rip, and there was a few other sounds around, but this bird would not stop. It was like a real solo gig, and that formed the end of the piece. A bit of noise reduction, and it's just beautiful. He was literally or the bird. I say he, it could be whatever, was only literally kind of 4 or 5 meters away. So as you can imagine, with good microphones, it captured the sound really well. So from that point of view, kind of lockdown has actually been quite interesting from my point of view. Again, doing a project that I would perhaps not have done before if I'd have just carried on the same trajectory. That ability to stop and I suppose the slowness, reflecting on, I mean, I've never taken recordings over a year before to do that. I don't know, how has lockdown changed your practice or your thinking?
Well, first I wanted to ask, how are you, I wanted to ask about this piece because it sounds absolutely amazing. Like, how are you treating the sounds? Are you like having multiple layers of the same space, or are you treating them more linearly? I should just go and listen to it and I'll give you it, but I'm curious.
It's not released yet, but I mean, I will send it. But the piece is called "With Love from an Invader," which is a rather strange title. But Yan, as a Chinese photographer living in England, she became fascinated, believe it or not, by this one particular rhododendron bush in this particularly isolated space. And of course, the rhododendron bush, extremely, everybody knows about them in the UK, and they're commonplace, but they are actually an invasive species. And for her, there was a striking parallel between looking at this very beautiful occurrence in nature, this bush, as an invasive species, and then what was happening in society, not only with coronavirus, but with the way that Chinese people were being treated in the UK when they were, especially at the very beginning, So for her, there's actually quite a political undercurrent in looking at this particular plant, this particular, its history, because obviously was brought to the UK through kind of, colonial kind of explorations in India and other kinds of, places. So it's quite a kind of charged piece. But the sounds themselves, as I think what we've tried to do is to present, it's almost like a sonographic portrait of the place throughout each season, but it has these sine tones in it that have a kind of, at certain points they're kind of melodic, but other points they represent that kind of invasive quality into the landscape. So there's a real juxtaposition between these incredibly unprocessed natural sounds and these incredibly artificial sounds. And they don't sound that jarring. They're not meant to sound that jarring, but the disjunct between them, both timbrally and how they're produced, is very much a part of the piece.
Oh, that sounds incredible. I can't wait to hear that.
I mean, I have to say, it's turned out to be a huge piece. It's like 46 minutes long in the end.
Wow.
And Yan has made this kind of stop motion film out of all of the photographs as well, and various other things, looking at the kind of seeds, the leaves, producing these many different art pieces that will come out of it. But this one one project as an installation it's very different from my point of view, and has been really refreshing to come back to it. At certain points, there is quite a layering of material, especially during the kind of summer, to try and express all the different kind of vibrancy and life that's going on. Believe it or not, you would think of winter in an isolated space as being quite desolate and, quite actually, when you start
noisy.
Recording, it's incredibly noisy. You get, these bits of ice that kind of cracking, the sounds of walking on snow and things like that. You kind of sit and you turn up the gain on the microphone, and you realize that actually there are so many things going on. It's just they're very, very small, but they sound absolutely fascinating when you do turn up the gain and you look for these other sounds rather than just the more overt ones like the birds and so on.
I love this idea of the pandemic, as tragic as it has been. It's sort of stripping away the buffet from everyone, and you're left to reckon with. Or you make the discovery of things like your project, these sound worlds, which as you say, you wouldn't have done if the pandemic situation hadn't occurred, because it wouldn't occur to us to do a project like that without the situation we found ourselves in. I
think the other fascinating thing, and I know Pete Stollery has talked about this in his sound map, is the way in which the recording space itself changed. So the initial recordings we did last March and April, for example, they have an eerie silence about them.
No one outside. There's
no one outside. Often, even when it was a beautiful sunny day, we would be the only people up there. There was very little traffic, no air traffic. It completely changed the environment and how you heard things in that environment. And from my point of view, that, of course, you're wandering about with a pair of headphones on and microphones, so everything sounds like everything is magnified. But the thing that struck me was, having done plenty of things like that before, I always get annoyed by this, the low background car noises, or, a siren, or, you can hear a plane from miles away. And there was none of that. I remember sitting on top of one of the hills up there, probably for half an hour, just listening, thinking this is actually a unique experience in my life. Yes, it's tragic, as you say, but, this is probably never going to happen again.
No.
I don't know if you ever have those kind of moments where you think, this is something I'm going to remember for the rest of my life, even when you're experiencing it. That was one of those moments.
so great to talk to you about all of these things. It's just been such a pleasure to hear your thoughts on everything from pandemic soundscape to, you know, the work that you did in the early 2000s. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure. And hopefully at some point in the future, be it at NoiseFloor or somewhere else, we'll actually meet in person. But
I would really like that.